Hey, should be live. Get a drink of water. Forgive my voice. I have been feeling a bit under the weather. Today we caught something, probably what everybody would expect, but I'm here for the final stream of 2022. This one is one that I feel like could definitely be broken into two streams, and we honestly might do a second stream on it sometime in 2023, but I wanted to touch on some things on it beforehand. It's tough to always choose content for this because there's so much incredible content on the subjects that this channel deals with being generated constantly. And it's being generated by small channels and large channels and people who, everybody's heard of and people who nobody has heard of. And so it is definitely difficult to choose which streams to focus on. Next year, we are going to try and change some things up, but it's going to be fairly similar. We might need to change some of the times for the streams, but I will keep everybody updated on that next week. We will have a normal stream next week, but I will be updating everybody on the coming the plans for the coming year. So I'm definitely very excited about where this channel will go in 2023, and I'm very grateful for where this channel has gone in 2022. I have never focused on growth on this channel as the main focus, which is part of why I do live streams that are long every single week. That's not really the way to grow an audience or grow subscribers, I guess, as fast as possible, but that's never been the goal. I'm very grateful for everybody that does sit through these streams and gives this channel their time. It has kept me motivated and coming back every week so consistently that people like these live streams, even if it's going to achieve far less views than it would if it was, 10-minute pre-recorded, video or something like that. It's definitely worth it for me to do these live streams and interact with you guys in the chat. So please hit the like button. It definitely helps with the algorithm. Patreon is below. Links to my website are below. Links to the full discussion we're going to cover tonight is also below. And, comment in the live chat any questions that you have, and I will get to them. So without further ado, this is the stream that we're going to be taking a look at tonight. This was with Terrence Deacon, and it is on Curt Jaimungal's Theories of Everything YouTube channel, which is one that everybody who watches this channel would be very familiar with. Terrence Deacon is an American neuroanthropologist. He taught at Harvard for 8 years, relocated to Boston University in 1992, and is currently the professor of anthropology. I think that's correct, but we will double check. Yeah, it looks like so. His theoretical interests include the study of evolution-like processes at multi-levels, including their role in embryonic development, neural signal processing, language change, social processes, and focusing especially on how these different processes interact and depend on each other. He's long stated an interest in developing a scientific semiotics, particularly biosemiotics, that would contribute to both linguistic theory and cognitive neuroscience. So semiotics, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is the systematic study of sign processes and meaning making, essentially. So any activity, conduct, or process that involves signs, in which a sign is defined as anything that communicates something, usually called a meaning. So basically, it's a theory of information and how information is interpreted and absorbed. That's what it appears to be. And this is very similar to sentient singularity theory and the origins of it in my work, one of my first models I remember was, if you took in one bit of information, how could one bit of information become more than one bit of information just from one bit of information, not from, taking in multiple bits of information. Essentially, how would you take that one bit and basically spin it into multiple bits of information and end up with a final thought, essentially. And I created some models that show how that is essentially done. But this is something that this study of how information is processed within a mind, essentially, is something that's very close to sentient singularity theory. And what's interesting is that this is where physics has to go, because when you're talking about physics and somebody says, oh, it's all matter, and then somebody says, well, matter is energy, so it's all energy, and then what is energy? Energy is information. That's really what energy is. And so all matter is information. All information is energy and matter, essentially. And those are like two sides of the one coin of information that is what makes up our world. And that includes the internal processing of a mind and the external processing of an environment via mental processes, essentially. So, but we're going to talk about this because this is where physics goes. Even Curt Jaimungal in his video that we will cover again, because I have covered it in the past, but in 2023 we're going to kind of take a new look on some of the same subject matter as was covered early on in this channel, before it had the audience that it does and before it had the structure that it does. And one of those things that we looked at was emergence theory by Curt Jaimungal, and he has a video called What is Reality? It's very good. It has millions of views on YouTube. I highly suggest that you watch it. And in it, he's got a little funny cartoon about how physicists are arguing whether or not the universe is material or if it's energetic, and then somebody comes in and says, oh, it's information, and they're like, no, it's actually energy. And then it's like, no, energy is information. So basically it's just funny back and forth, and it shows the dogma of scientific materialism, essentially. But I will say that is breaking, and we're going to cover some discussions that I've been listening to at the beginning of 2023 that have to do with even those people who are completely part of the established scientific narrative, I guess, in the physics world, have been changing their tune and opening up to the possibility that metaphysics is a requirement. Sorry, I'm late. Good evening. You're not late. We just got started, Preston. But okay, so first clip. Let's do that. I will say this stream with Terrence Deacon is very, very technical, and it's definitely worth doing 2 streams on. I don't know if I'm going to do 2 streams on it, so I might stay pretty high level. And there's definitely things, even at a high level, that are very worth looking into. He says things that I only heard myself say that are critical to understanding reality, actually, even though they sound kind of cliche when you say them. But this is his definition, his explanation of semiotic theory. First clip.
In the following sense, that he was interested in what most theorists of mind have been interested in before and since, and that is this question about mental representation. How are things represented? When something is represented, of course, it's not there. It's something standing in for it in some ways. But it doesn't help us understand what that actual physical relationship is. And one of the challenges ever since in philosophy has been to try to make sense of that. Peirce's way of approaching it was to say, no, there's actually 3 different ways in which this is done. And he was recognizing that there are representations by likeness, iconic, he called it, representations by correlation or contiguity or part-whole relationships, causal relationships of some form. He called indexical relationships. And then the kind of relationships that words, for example, have to what they represent, which is based on some kind of agreement of how to interpret sounds. But there's nothing about the words we produce in most cases that is linked to what they represent, right? We sometimes gloss this over by saying it's arbitrary. One of the things that's happened in linguistics, and one of the things that got me interested in language and the origins of language, was why we're the only species that does this.
We're the only species that does this, meaning does language.
Does language. Or in fact, what I'll eventually say is that does what we would call symbolic communication. That is something distinct from iconic and indexical communication. The question is, for me at the time, who became interested eventually in the neurosciences, I've spent most of my career as a neuroscientist, studying mostly development of brains and how they've evolved. And my original question was, well, so what happened if language is so unusual, and it takes a very unusual kind of cognition to accomplish it? It must have evolved at some point. And therefore, there should be, in effect, a reflection of this in the structure of the human brain and how it's different from non-human brains. So I got into the neurosciences to try to find it. In fact, my PhD work was tracing connections in monkey brains to try to find out what's fundamentally different about human brains that makes language possible. And this is where, in interaction, I became interested in Noam Chomsky, took courses from him. We never quite agreed about this, in part because, of course, he's coming to language from a formal point of view, and I was coming to language from a biological point of view. Where we came into conflict was this an accident of evolution, some kind of magical thing that happened to the brain, a miracle that we don't understand, and it happened all at once, and language pops in suddenly? Unfortunately, it doesn't explain very much. If you want to say, well, language is, there's some algorithm that makes it possible, and that's in the brain. As a biologist, you want to explain, okay, how is it organized? What parts of the brain are involved? What parts of the brain changed between chimpanzees and ourselves to make it not only possible, but easy? We acquire languages easily. Even though, multiple languages become more and more difficult as we get older. Nevertheless, we're pretty good at it, and no other species can even get close. Maybe not even start, although I think there's some evidence that they could start, but to get very far, almost not at all. So there had to be something about the brain, and we knew that brains got bigger. That's one thing, but bigger is a pretty generic feature. And I spent a lot of time studying why human brains are in fact larger than other primate brains, for example, and why primate brains are, on average, larger for their body size than any other mammals. And we've now shown that, in fact, the size story is really a red herring in lots of interesting ways. And we can come back to talk about that. But as a result, I became very much interested in this. And
Okay, so like I said, there's so much to this that I've watched it twice. I need to watch it again. But so it's an interesting subject always for me that wasn't in the beginning, because I thought I've never been like the most linguistically talented person, I guess you could say. I failed Spanish class, okay, guys, and I have never been the best at putting my thoughts into words, but I actually have gotten extremely good at putting these ideas related to objective fundamental reality, whatever you want to call it, into a linguistic framework, I think, and that's it's been part of the reason for the success of me building sentient singularity theory, and it has changed my viewpoint on this dramatically. And I've talked about this before. Remember having one of the most intense philosophical discussions I've ever had was with Michael Knowles really late at night, and it was about this. It was about like the importance of language and communication, and I thought that you could just or in processing even, and I thought you could just visualize geometric structures essentially, and that you didn't need the words in order to make sense of the world. And I stand by that to some degree, but I would add to that and say that there is something about being able to have a formal, complex language that on the level that humans have it, that allows you to understand concepts that cannot be understood otherwise. They just can't. And if they can, it's only on an individual basis, and they cannot be communicated to others. And that is like the key distinction between us and, I think, other beings that he's talking about, like birds and primates that can kind of get the beginnings of language down, even dogs. And, they can form associations with, a multiplicity of different words and symbols, yet they don't have the ability, due to their physiology and other constraints, to start taking those associations and marking them down outside of their own body, essentially, and sharing them with the group. They also usually don't have the same exact social structures that humans do, even though, yes, humans have tribal structures just like most primates and even birds. There's a difference between human structures and other the social structures of other highly complex social animals like primates. Humans are essentially eusocial, and in our mentality, that doesn't mean necessarily that we are physically completely there, but we are actually definitely partially there. That's why we have no hair. The only other eusocial mammal on Earth is the naked mole rat. It's also the only other naturally naked mammal, and there's a reason for that. It's because of eusociality. And this definitely aids in the formation and translation and communication of complex language, among a group, and also allows for a centralization structure that doesn't occur outside of a eusocial system, which you need that centralization structure to some degree to organize a complex language that gets distributed among a group. Eventually, we have dictionaries, and that is kind of like the king or queen almost of a dispersed system among beings. And so it's not just our mental structures, our brain structures that are relevant to the formation of complex language, even though it is obviously important. It's also our social structure, which is different than other primates and like dolphins and whales and birds. But there's a multiplicity of things happening here. Our opposable thumbs, the fact that we live on land instead of in the ocean, all of these things allow us for tool creation, and then for that tool creation can be used to write down a language, and then that combined with our social tendencies can allow for a complex language to be dispersed, but also have, a hierarchy to its maintenance, I guess you could say, kind of just like a dictionary provides for today, and has for a very long time. It's just, they might used to be written on stone. So there's a lot of things that are very important to this. I'm not saying I understand all of them, but I have given this a great deal of thought, and I do try and usually look at things that are outside the brain as as most important and most relevant when it comes to really anything. And I think that that's the most important way of looking at things, because it's the systems outside the brain that are really going to influence the system that is the brain. And the brain is just the physically manifested structure, the physical manifestation of the structure that is the entanglement point of strings of information that make up a mind. It's not, it is a result of information processing. It's not really an information processor, and it, to some degree it is, but it's, even then, it's like a reflection of the true information processor, which is the mind. It's like a mind is a knot of information, and that's why your brain looks kind of like a knot. It's just like the physical manifestation of that entanglement point that of all these strings of information that are make up your mind. Essentially, you are a mind. I've said this before. The difference between a mind and a brain is that you are a mind and you have a brain. It's very different. But I think that this focus on language is very important, because you'll either get there when you get there inevitably when you start looking at how information is processed by a mind, because you can't not get there. I mean, it's just, it's inevitable. When you start examining the human mind as an information processor, you're going to get to complex language, and then you have to figure out why it is different for humans than it is other beings. And people say all kinds of things like, oh, it was the introduction of the eating more meat, and that increased protein, increased the ability for our brain to grow, and that allowed for complex thinking in ways that weren't possible to more primitive primates. And I'm not saying that none of that it matters, or none of that is true, but there are much more key factors in making even that happen that are not going to be discovered by probably looking at the brain. They're going to be seen or predicted by looking at the totality of the human experience, including their social experience, which is very different than pretty much any other primate that's out there. It's much more similar to naked mole rats than it is to chimpanzees, which is, very fascinating. I mean, it's the model organism that is most closely associated with human beings that I use to most closely that is closest in being to a human, I guess, that I use in my work when I'm looking for recurring patterns, is naked mole rats, not chimpanzees or dolphins or birds or anything like that. There are commonalities among all sentient beings. There's commonalities among the organism level multicellular sentient beings, but then there's also something about having a eusocial system that is especially unique as well in how they process information, and that includes humans. So just interesting that he's looking at that. Like I said, we're going to stay pretty high level, and I will continue to rewatch this, I'm sure, over time, and we will touch back on anything that comes out as that I think is especially important to touch on, but in the future. So the next clip is about something that he actually said here that I actually disagree with, but I'm not sure I have the proof of it, or I don't have the proof of it or anything like that, but I just think that it's important to think more about. Is basically he said in the previous clip that
attracted to certain things and repelled by certain.
That language, that the words in language in our language are essentially arbitrary, and that they could, and I think in other parts of this discussion he says they could mean anything, but I don't think that that's actually true. I think that there's something about the sound that a word makes and the syllables that it has, and its relationship with other words that create degrees of freedom and constraints that would only allow it to be certain sounds. Okay, that doesn't mean it couldn't be, it could only be this sound, but it maybe could only be these three sounds. But it couldn't be, maybe we could not use the word dirt for water, but we could use the word agua, okay? Or we could use the word maya, or main, or another word that for in a different language for water, and we could have used those, but they were dependent upon their relationships with other words that had already been formed. But I don't think that words are arbitrary. I think they can't be. It's actually, and I'm not sure that he believes this outside the context of this discussion, but I do not believe that it is possible for these words to be arbitrary and just be memorized as being associated with certain things. If the word is going to stick, okay, then it has to have relationships with other words that allow for us to kind of usually interpret a bit of what it means and place it into context. But also, it has to sound to some degree like the picture that it creates in our mind. And I think that that's an underrated quality of a word that it might not be able to ever really dive into too concretely, but I do think that it's at least would be understandable enough to show that there's that is there, but I'm not exactly sure how to do it. So there's that. But it's interesting also that he said that there's this trialic set way of understanding words. It's like what was it? We said it was indexical and symbolic and iconic, essentially. And that makes sense, that there's this triality to our understanding. And I would say that it would probably be one of those would be an intrinsic constraint, and then there'd probably be like some word that could show all three of those. And that's just based on the patterns that I've observed in sentient singularity theory, is that there's always a triality is always really a duality of degrees of freedom with an intrinsic constraint, and then there's also like a word that will be the fourth, uniting label, kind of like past, present, future, and then you could say like time. But sentient singularity theory's patterns would predict that. So that makes sense. I need to dive a bit more into the specific meaning of these, but when he's talking about these different ways of interpreting information, we'll get into it, but it sounds a lot like what I saw in my models, where one bit of information is basically essentially spun into multiple bits of information, and as it's spun, you create symmetry patterns, and those symmetries are what are used to understand the relationships between things, and also to generate new information from existing information. Is you always use symmetry patterns. So the same thing would happen with language. It's the same thing that happens with numbers, and you can see that pattern in numbers, and I bet you would be able to see it in language as well. I have not gotten to the point where I could create a model to show it to you in a specific language, human language, but I have definitely observed it and have, and am able to show it in numbers, which means that it would also be probably in language, because it's still just about information and the relation of different informational structures to each other that build, because you can't You're building from one. You always have to build from one. You can't build from nothing, but you have to build from one. So it creates constraints that you would end up with certain commonalities between language that are pretty much inescapable. And you can see that in even just grammatical rules and different like nouns and verbs and adverbs and things like that. These follow patterns that I've seen in my work. But when it comes to the actual alphabet of something, I looked at it, and I've looked at a lot of different alphabets, and I can see certain patterns, but I'm not good enough at the language to know to dive deep into it. So I'm not going to get too much into it. But I will say I've looked at it, and there's commonalities in languages that I've even seen already in just some of my work in the past. It's been a while since I've looked at it, but I realize certain languages evolve from other languages, but there's also going to intrinsically, inescapably be commonalities between multiplicity of languages, between all languages. There are certain things that need to be communicated by everyone. But here he's talking about a sign on the bathroom of like a woman in a skirt versus a man. So here.
And they're icons and indices of various kinds. We can also produce conventional icons and indices. I mean, think about the stick figures on restroom doors, for example. They're both iconic in a crude sense, in part because of a convention that we have. I mean, girls don't wear dresses anymore, skirts anymore, and yet that's typically the figure in the West that we still have on restroom doors. It's there conventionally, but also because it's supposed to be iconic. But the fact that it's affixed to a particular door is indexical. It says that this indicates that behind this door, there's supposed to be males versus females. So icons and indices they're everywhere. The question is, how do we develop a capacity to represent something if the sign vehicle we're using has no relationship to what it represents? That's the language problem. And for years, and this begins, I would say, hundreds of years back in time, we've just sort of assumed that, well, this is just a convention. We just agree that it does. The problem is that conventions just don't happen by accident. The problem is, yes, a miracle could happen and give us language and allow us to have all the same ways of doing it. Or, like any other convention, any other social habit, it takes communication to set it up. So think about any other thing that we agree upon to do, a habit that we have socially. To establish that convention, we have to communicate about it. Now, that means you can't use a convention to produce a convention unless you already have a first convention. How do you get the first one? How do you get language when there's no language? When there's no other conventional form of communication? And that is, just watch young children. They recognize things that are like each other. They communicate to others by sharing objects of a certain kind. They point or reach. That is, pointing is an index. Objects that you can play with, or food that's always food, or drink that's always drink. Each instance is iconic of each other.
Okay. I think that the problem here is a non-problem. And this is the same problem as how do you get something from nothing? And you can't. I say this in my video of, about theories of everything, the how-to guide that I highly suggest that you watch. It was my entry into the Pace 1 competition for Curt Jaimungal's channel. And I say that you can't, everything that's built has to be built from something that's already there. And you cannot get something from nothing. You can only build with materials that that already exist. And so when you say something like, well, where does language come from? Well, it has to start forming from in the existence of no language, essentially. And if you want to see that happen, just look at children. I don't think that makes any sense. Children are being raised within an environment in which people are constantly using language, and I get that, like, they're not, but that's not the point. The point is that other people are. And also, you're not starting from nothing even there, because there are certain sounds and that are caused by our reactions to things that are not conscious. They're just instinctual. And those sounds, those are probably the very, very early building blocks of, and the frame that form the framework of a complex language that would evolve from that. Even outside the system of seeing somebody else using complex language already, if you're a, I don't know, like a proto-human of some type, and you get poked, and you're like, ow, like, that's your reaction. Then that sound is going to be used, that ouch kind of sound, is going to be used as an index point, or that would frame, more complex and more abstract words that to describe more abstract concepts. Things like when you eat and you're like or like when you see something funny and you laugh. Nobody teaches babies how to laugh. They just do it because things are funny to them, and nobody teaches them really what's funny either. They just know. We just know. I've talked about this before. My geckos have this. They will laugh at each other, and it's always like very, very like simple things. Like one falls and the other one will laugh. And I'm just like, holy crap! That's amazing. Like a lizard is laughing, but you can hear it, but you have to watch them all day long and live among them constantly to see this. But I've watched them laugh at each other from falling and getting hurt and things like that. And you can see their facial expression is literally like, it's like, this very slight smile to it even. But you have to really, really look. Obviously, this is not something that you're just going to see walking down your sidewalk when the lizard runs across it. You'll never notice anything about that lizard's behavior except it's afraid of you. But when you live next to them, you can see this kind of thing. And you can see this with your dogs. When they play, what they think is funny is to like push each other and to fake fight, and to bite and growl and act like they're in a fight, but not, because there's something understood about how it's funny to act out aggression, but not really. I don't know why, but they know it. Nobody teaches it to them, but they just know. And it's taught through the interaction of with others. But I think that it's important to recognize that there is no blank slate. There is no blank slate. One of the things that I've noticed is, and that I think about all the time, is there's one sound in animals that I see in basically every species that I have been able to closely observe them go about their lives, and that is like the kissing noise and the kissing act of like putting your lips on each other. It's a very, very universal action, and it's a very, very universal sound. Dogs do it. Geckos do it. I have videos of it I'll show at some point. And the sound, even for geckos, is the same. Monitor lizards will do it with not the same sound, because they don't have the same type of tongue and mouth. It's like a forked tongue, kind of more like a snake, but they still make the same action, and where they'll touch lips. And I think about this all the time. It's like I'll be just walk into a room with my wife, and like, or we'll just be sitting there, and I'll just be like make like a kissing noise, and she'll just like do it back. It's like so instinctive and so odd. And every single time lately, especially, every time it happens, I think about it. And because it's like, what is being communicated in that moment? It's like, I acknowledge you, and I care for you, essentially, basically is what that means. Like, I acknowledge you and I care for you. It's not just I see you, it's like I see you, and you mean a lot. And we do this, that's why we do this action with people that we care most about, your family, and, even in Europe and whatever, it's done as a greeting, but it's done as a greeting of like acceptance at least. And it's such a universal thing, but it's a very, that makes it linguistically fascinating because it's not a word, but it's more of an action, but it's also a sound, and it's so common across species. And it communicates something kind of complex. It's not just, danger, water, fear, it's something that's like very social. It's not like when you get scared and you yell and like that fear response of like that. Nobody needs to teach you that, but that is a sound that now is associated with a specific, idea that something's scary. And then what's the opposite sound of that? That, would be associated with something that's not frightening, but something desirable. Maybe it's like, something tastes good or something like that. That's how you start to form language. You get one bit of information, and maybe that's instinctual, but that even then, it's still not a blank slate. It's coming from systems below. And then to form this, the sound that represents something is tasty or something feels good, that sound, like that is the opposite sound almost of like, like something that hurts or something that's frightening or something that is not enticing. It's something that, you want to avoid. And there's a symmetry relationship that's happening there that you're able to build, a word for something enticing due to its symmetrical relationship with the sound that would be instinctual for something that's, not pleasant. Something that's frightening or something that's painful. So there's no such thing as a blank slate. And it's just whenever somebody tries to solve this blank slate problem, they never make any progress because there is no progress to be made. You're always starting with one. You always have to start with at least one bit of information that is already there, and then see where you build from. You can build from there, and you'll actually make quite a bit more progress. I'm not an expert, by the way, on languages or anything like that, so I'm not claiming to be. But I will say that my work is essentially it's a sentient singularity theory. Models are about the building of information processing systems, and therefore the building of information from a single bit that is entered. If you look at the models that I have made, where right here, you can see where this bit of information enters. If this is a 0, then there's nothing, there's nothing around here. But if I put in a 1, you can see all of these fill in. And none of these are arbitrary numbers. This structure can only be done the way that it's done because it has certain constraints built in, which is that there has to be a symmetry relationship between this one and 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 this one. So it has to symmetrically build information. And but you could change it, to some degree, where you could be like, instead of it being this being this plus this, it could be like equals this plus this. And same thing, this could be equals this plus this. But as long as they're symmetrical, that's the constraint. And that's kind of what language is probably like too. And like I said, you have to start with one and then bit of information, maybe one sound, that sound of like when you get hurt. And then there has to be a symmetrical sound to that would be its opposite, that would also convey the opposite idea, that you know? All of these models, this model is built out of the models that I just showed you. All of this builds from one bit of information and symmetry patterns. So you input one, and all of this gets worked out. All of these calculated values come into play. And you're not starting from zero, though. It's not starting from a zero. If we put in a zero, there's nothing. There's zero information. Then this structure wouldn't even be built, because the structure is built from the evolution of the information contained within it as well. So you have to put in one bit of information to start any system of understanding. It's just a requirement. Any questions of how do you get something from nothing? How do you build language from it not existing? These questions are bad questions, because it's not true that you can get anything from nothing, or that anything comes from nothing, and it's not true that any language is started really from scratch. It's not. It might be built from 1 to 3 to 4 key sounds that then complex concepts are built around, or complex words that formulate that convey complex concepts are built around. But you're always starting with something. And even if it's like a kissing sound, it's like why? I don't know. Maybe it comes from the fact that the touching of lips makes that sound, kind of, or the touching of tongues or something, because doing that is something that you would only do with someone who you are, who is part of your family, essentially. If you are a lizard, I don't know, a fish, something before humans in the evolutionary path. And, fish kiss. Like, what? Because it's an intimate action. It's conveying, even through the action of touching another, mouth to another one's mouth. It's like it conveys comfort and acceptance of, and like a sharing of resources. It's fascinating. We're so focused on words in linguistic, discussions, but it would be, you have to start from before that. You have to start like the kissing action, and then you get to the kissing sound, and then the yelling. That's like it's like an instinctual, like sound that you make, I guess, or instinctual reaction. Like that is probably 0.0 of, or 0.1, the point that is the first, bit of information that goes on to build a language. And then eventually you get it so complex that it's like bathroom signs, as he was discussing. This is another thing that I think is interesting, is that when we look at the signs for bathroom, even in the West, where women, like you said, most often do not wear skirts or dresses anymore. And yes, it's very rare for men to wear them, and but that's not been the case in every single society. There's people wear kilts in I think that's in Scotland or something. They used to, but it is interesting that there is this common sign that represents men and women especially when you see it side by side. And it's always two things. And I've thought a lot about this. And actually, when I was first building my set for this show, it was originally called The Math of Meaning. And this was many, many years ago, when I was living somewhere else, and it was before I had any theory of physics. I wasn't interested in physics, but I was still interested in philosophy and morality and God and theology and kind of metaphysics. But I had started on my just personal YouTube channel, and I bought these bathroom signs. One said like men and it had like the little man symbol. One said women, it had the little women's symbol. And I was going to put them under one side. I was going to put the male over here and the female over here. And I didn't do that because it just was unnecessary, but I was originally going to do that with my background when I was planning it. I even bought them, and I still have them. I think they're in my desk here somewhere. And I was going to talk about gender, and I do talk about gender quite a bit on this channel. And because gender helps us understand, quite a bit of things, including it helps us understand signs for the bathroom, But what's interesting is that no matter which culture of the world you're from, if you see a male like outline of a human where it's just like a little stick figure of person with legs and arms and a head, and then you see a stick figure person next to it with a little dress and then long hair, which those are always the two things that distinguish the female gender sign from the male, is not just a dress, it's actually also pretty much always long hair. And that was fascinating to me, because when you look at theological traditions across the world, the having of long hair, and usually the covering of it in the Bible, Jesus, I don't think it was Jesus actually that said it, I can't remember, but in the New Testament it says, it's a woman should have long hair because it's part of her feminine beauty essentially, but she should cover it. And if she doesn't cover it, then she might as well. She should probably cut it short. But then it says it's disgraceful to have short hair though for a woman, so she should probably leave it long. And that's what it says in the verse. But every single culture has this similar dress code for women versus men. It's like a dress versus. It's like women are always in skirts, even if men are sometimes in like a skirt type of, wardrobe or piece of clothing that looks like a skirt, like those big gigantic pants that were used in by samurai and ancient Japan, and basically they were used for like to protect your legs from when you're riding a horse. But we see them in martial arts practice today when you're doing like Aikido or something like that. It looks like a dress, but it's actually pants. But they would still recognize, I bet you even if you took a person from back then brought them forward in time to today, put them in, an American hallway going into a bathroom, they'd be able to pick which one was male, which one was female. And it's because there's universalities about these traits. There's something universal about these traits that are due to, probably certainly multiple different reasons, but that are linked to gender beyond and prior to the creation of specific symbols and specific words. You probably could not ever have the stick figure with a dress and long hair represent men, and have the stick figure without a skirt and without long hair representing women in any culture. Even if you, from the very start of the creation of that symbol, from the very first start of a public bathroom, if you tried to do it, you probably couldn't. It probably wouldn't catch on, and eventually you'd probably still end up with the same exact symbols that we have today. We will not escape them. But every theological tradition in the world pretty much has the same like moral requirements for female and male dress. And even where there's bits of overlap, there are certain things that are consistent. And, they're probably due to physical requirements of men and women that influence, dress, what is most practical for them to dress in. And, outside of odd activities like rock climbing or something like that. But it's interesting, though, even the creation of that symbol it's not done in a vacuum. There are certain constraints that are placed onto that due to the roles of men and women that influence the types of clothing that they must wear due to our social dynamics, our sexual dynamics, our physical constraints and abilities, and our, familial roles, things like that. our societal roles and our roles in society, what is expected of you as a man versus what is expected of you as a woman. Those all feed into what you dress, how you dress, and how you cut your hair, and all of those feed into the symbol that we use. And it's never a blank slate. There are constraints, there are degrees of freedom. Always, in every system, there are always degrees of freedom that would allow for some, bit of change that is, due to all kinds of reasons, preferences, the moment, whatever, timing. But then there's also constraints that just cannot be violated. And I think the bathroom sign is one that has always interested me as well. And that's why it was going to be on here, to represent genders, because it universally represents gender dynamics. And it doesn't matter what the dress is of, the people involved in that culture. They would probably always be able to, especially in seeing one of them next to the other, be able to tell you which one was the female sign for female, which one was the sign for male. It's fascinating, but you need that symmetry relationship, though, very often, in order to perceive the correct meaning or have the correct interpretation of the information that's being conveyed. So if you took just the male stick figure and you never had it next to the female stick figure with the dress and the long hair, and you showed that to people's of all cultures who for some reason had never seen the bathroom symbols, you're like, what does this represent? They would be like, probably person. They wouldn't probably think man. But if you put it next to the person in the dress and the long hair, now it's a man. The other one is now a woman. And that builds the information because you can observe a symmetry relationship, just like, and it's like those two different kind of symmetrical sounds. Symmetry relationships are how all correspondences are recognized. And that is how information is able to be built without actually adding something new. So you can kind of say, well, the opposite is this. Now you have something new. It's fascinating. Hey guys, what's going on? Why does it have to be sound? What about sign language? It doesn't have to be sound. This would work perfectly well with sign language. Preston and Vlad, what's up? It's a system, yes. Where's the symbology of Samson's hair? I don't know what you're talking about. If men are hunting, long hair might get caught in trees. Exactly. And if they're using machinery or doing tasks that, require nimbleness and then and a high degree of kinesthetic awareness, then you wouldn't want things flowing. It's like why superheroes probably wouldn't wear capes is because they would get caught in everything. It's fascinating to me. One of the pieces of clothing that I think will actually not stick around forever as a sign of in modern culture is the tie. Because the tie is a sign of masculinity, it's a sign of men, but it's actually a very impractical and dangerous piece of clothing. Anybody who does any kind of martial arts or even doesn't knows that you would definitely not want to get into a fight while wearing a tie. It puts you at an enormous disadvantage. You now literally have a noose around your neck. You would never want to be working with machinery with a tie on. You have to make sure you don't flush down the toilet or something like that. Let alone, get it caught in a wood chipper. You're going in if it does. And if you get into a fight with a tie on, somebody's got a noose that they can grab that's already around your neck. It's such an impractical piece of clothing. It's very not masculine, actually. And I think that its evolution, and this is just a theory, is within the constraints of being perceived by women heavily. So it's whatever jobs led to the evolution of the culture of the tie would be in the environment in which women were present. I don't think that the tie originally evolved as a signal from one man to another man. It's a signal from a man to a woman. You know, it's like when I got married, my wife was like, I just want you to wear a bow tie. I never wear bow ties, you know, but I wore a bow tie for my wedding and for other people's weddings if I'm in the actual wedding. That's it. I've never worn a bow tie outside of that. That's because it's what she wanted. Okay? And I don't care. You know, I think ties and bow ties are just completely impractical. But the fact that she wanted it shows that it's valuable to her for some reason. Bow ties much less impractical than a tie. I won't say they're more practical because they're not, but they're much less impractical and dangerous than a tie is. But still, totally not a useful piece of clothing, other than it appeals to women for the most part. And I think that is, so long as you're in a mixed gendered environment, that's when you're going to see ties kind of be a thing, you know, if weather permitting. But I think about that piece of clothing a lot because it is clearly a piece of clothing that is purely for the sake of conveying information, but not for the sake of being useful intrinsically. You know, it's not a coat where it protects you from the cold. You know, it's not pants or shirt or anything like that. It's like, it's just totally divorced from any kind of practical purposes outside of being a sign that conveys something. And it conveys status. That's what it conveys. It conveys status to who? To women. That's to who? No man would, if there were no women around to view how you dressed, even if you wanted to dress nicely, eventually ties would disappear from that environment. I don't know if they will actually disappear because we're in a mixed gender work environment for the most part, but I'm not even sure if that will last forever, to be quite honest with you. But it will certainly last, you know, a fair amount longer. And then those types of things will continue to be incentivized. But it's just it's like a piece of language. It's a sign, you know, it's not practical. It's just conveying a message. The message is, I have status and probably resources, and you know, and the message is specifically to women. I just know I grew out of my hair during the plague and justify it by saying I'm going for the anime look. I grew out my beard dramatically during lockdown. The sign of Libra is the sign of symmetry. It's also the sign of cultural, verbal communication and beauty. Interesting. I wrote this thing, and it's on my website, and then we'll look at the next clip. You go to sentiencesingularity.com. This is probably the best thing I've ever written, and I literally have no idea where it came from, but it just came out of nowhere one day. But not out of nowhere. Nothing comes out of nowhere, like I said. But it came from beyond my immediate attention. But it says, the search for truth is the search for objectivity. The search for objectivity is the search for symmetry. The search for symmetry is the search for beauty. But the truest beauty is always the searcher. And the truth of the searcher is that they are symmetrical to the sought. What this means is that what this statement allows for is backtracking through the symmetry relationships of the words used to basically state that, determine that that the searcher, that someone is what is always most beautiful. The truest beauty is always the searcher. And the truth of the searcher is that they're symmetrical to the sought, which means like it's a mirror image of what is sought, which means that someone seeks someone, and that is what is most beautiful. What we are seeking most is another someone, and that us as that seeker and the sought that is that also that someone is the most beautiful. basically, and that is what's most true. There's so much meaning in that statement, but you can tell it's like the truth of the searcher. The search for truth is the search for objectivity. The search for objectivity is the search for symmetry, and the search for symmetry is the search for beauty, but the truest beauty is always the searcher, and the truth of the searcher is that they're symmetrical to the sought. It's all about symmetries, but you can gain so much from kind of dissecting those symmetries, and you can backtrack statements that are indirectly related to each other, and to come to the understanding that, that there are parts of that statement that are indirectly related to other parts, but can still be used to define those other parts. This is true of all language. Next step. This next statement is about correlative continuity of information transfer. This is something that also was very similar, it seems, to my work.
What's happened is the reason we call this a codon relationship is there's a code-like relationship between them. That is, what we've done is we've figured out in biology now, evolution has figured this out, so to speak, how to take a linear relationship in one kind of molecule and create a particular kind of three-dimensional molecule made up of totally different kinds of atoms, that is made up of amino acids as opposed to nucleotides, and its function is determined by its three-dimensional structure, by how it's folded. So in effect, there's almost no relationship between them. This is why thinking of it as a code is not crazy. It's arbitrary. And yet the arbitrarity has been produced by this multi-step process that links covariance with correlation in a way that allows this to happen. That I like to call covariance relationships and correlation relationships grounded. They're grounded because the vehicle that carries it is carrying some feature in common with what it represents, with the information that it's carrying. So if it's a likeness relation, if it's a covariance relationship, it's carrying some kind of formal feature forward into another kind of molecule. Whereas if it's just physically correlated, struck together, not by virtue of likeness, but simply by virtue of being next to each other, being correlated, being attached, that also is grounded, physically grounded. One is formally grounded and one is physically grounded. But by stacking one on top of the other, it now produces a kind of distance between where you started and where you end. So that now there's what I call displaced reference. The information in the DNA molecule is there in the protein, but in a totally different form. There's been a continuity of information transfer, but a complete loss of groundedness at the physical level. And yet there's an informational groundedness because you've transferred the same correlations. As a result, there can be selection that affects proteins and how they interact, and that'll select for particular sequences of genes that produce those useful proteins, even though they're totally separate kinds of molecules.
Okay, so this is something that I noticed very early on with my work, and this is kind of it's the part of my work that will probably be most likely labeled pseudoscience, which is just a nonsense term. Okay, there's just models that lead to successful interpretations or successful predictive abilities, and then there's models that don't, and that's it. And like there is no such thing as pseudoscience. There's no definition that is accurate at all. And if you wanted to formalize one, it would have to be very specific and related to, just experimentation in some way. But there's no such thing as pseudoscience. In my work, when I formed this model, okay, one of the things that was most interesting to me was that It was about how do you build information, okay? And like I said, this information is calculative. But if you take one bit of information and through symmetry relationships, you end up, here, and then you interpret that information kind of from an outside perspective here and here in different ways. This one is all multiplication, same thing here, and then this is all addition here. And you end up, though, with this value, 33. And I thought that was interesting because that is the value that gets created when you're doing a 3x3 grid, basically like a matrix of 3x3, that basically builds information through symmetrical addition, and also that taking into account their position, symmetrical positioning and addition, you get eventually this. And this is a 3x3 matrix, essentially. And then it's calculating, 33 here. And so when you're looking at information processing from a very objective standpoint, you realize that addition and multiplication are very similar. One of them is the adding of information that was essentially not yet there, and the other one is the addition of information that was not previously there, and then the other is the multiplying of information that was previously there. And this is kind of how information builds just naturally, and kind of forms this spinorial relationship. And you also realize that the orders of operations in mathematics are fewer than 6, and because fundamentally addition and subtraction are the same, because in order to create something new, essentially, you have to take from something that already exists. So like if you want some cake on your plate and I have cake on my plate, and that's it, there's no other cake out there, in order to add cake to your plate, I have to subtract it from mine. Okay? And like I said, you can only build, you can't get cake from nowhere. There's just a cake that exists already, and you can take from that cake, which you can add cake from that, add from my cake, add to your cake by subtracting from my cake. And if you can also look at division and multiplication by looking at things like a cell, and when you have one cell, how does it multiply? It by dividing itself. So like it's one action, actually. It's not two actions. It multiplies itself through dividing itself. They're not separate things like they are in just linguistic interpretations of mathematics. But then now that you have these two sides, these two perspectives of one action, then now you can get two from one, basically. It's you can look at it from this perspective, from the perspective of the new cell, in which now you're seeing multiplication, or you can look at it from the perspective of the original cell, in which case now you're seeing division. Same thing with me and my having the original cake versus you getting part of my cake. You're either going to see I'm getting my cake subtracted from, but you're getting your amount of cake added to. The cake on your plate is being added. The cake on my plate is being subtracted from, but it's one action. So just from this one action and from two perspectives, you're basically now multiplying the amount of information. This means that even like exponentiation and like grouping, like parentheses in the order of operations in mathematics, you've got like, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. If addition and subtraction are fundamentally the same action, and multiplication and division are fundamentally the same action, then exponentiation and like grouping, I guess, is also the same action. It's like I I've been trying to think of a good word for it. One might already exist, but it's like entangling. That's what it is. It's like exponentiation and entanglement, or which is like fractalized separation and also like entanglement of, what is, you're creating multiple and then you're entangling those multiple into one when you put parentheses. And when you put an exponent, you're like fractalizing something. So this is how the universe works. It's a single sentient being making additional sentient beings within itself through this process. And it's the exponentiation and the entangling, I guess, are basically the constraints, and then there are 2 degrees of freedom of that would be the addition subtraction route or the multiplication division route. And it's almost like we need a word that means multiplication and division simultaneously. It's like mitosis. Isn't that what the separation of cells? Mitosis. Cell division. Yeah. You could say mitosis is like multiplication and division happening at once. It's like the word for this, that is the superposition of both. But so this structure, though, that was created right here, it's showing that the structure is a 3x3 grid, and the calculated value that is kind of the final value is 3x3. Okay? Means like there's a symmetry relationship between the information within and the structure. And you can also see this when you just highlight here and you see that the sum is 19. That's is 1 and 9. What's interesting is that there are 9 squares, 9 cells within this one square. So it's 9 and 1. And the sum of these values in here is 19, which is 9 and 1, which is what this is. The sum out here is 33, which is 3x3. Literally, super literally, guys. It's a 3x3. This is a 3x3. This also is a 9 and a 1. You can see here the 19. So this is what I mean by the information within is also being encapsulated in the structure itself. The information that's being calculated within the structure is also being conveyed by the structure itself. This is I call it an extra arithmetic symmetry. Okay? And it seems to be, you use symmetry patterns also, by the way, to build this from that. You do that, you just do the same thing. But these symmetry patterns that are stacked, in sentient singularity theory, you'll see in the paper that comes out, it's like there's 4 primary perspectives, and then there's this basically this 3x3 grid that's created of information generation, or it's the generation of information, of not all information, but of additional information. You start with 1 bit of information, and then from that 1 bit of information, you can generate more information. And but that 1 bit always exists. And then through symmetry patterns, you end up building that cosmological verse that I have, but we won't get into that now. But I think that this is kind of what Terrence Deacon is getting at when he's talking to Curt about this, is like there's information contained within the structure itself that corresponds in some way to other, maybe the information contained within it, or even the information that it's trying to link to, or something like that. I'm not exactly sure, because his work is his work and mine is mine, but I'm telling you that there is this, in fundamental structures, you can see that there's they are supersymmetric structures, I guess. Which is, I don't want to use that word, even though it kind of arises naturally from what I'm trying to describe. It's also, supersymmetry is also a word in physics that is used to describe something specific that I am not an expert on. So I can't say whether or not it is related to this concept. It might be, it might not be. I need to do more research on it to be able to tell you. But these extra arithmetic symmetries, as I call them, they're like supersymmetries. And I use that term possibly detached from how physicists have been using it, but maybe not. Maybe the structures in supersymmetry that is, that gave rise to that name are for some reason related to the concept, at least, that I'm trying to describe. Just like this supersymmetry, superposition of symmetries. Let's see here, supersymmetry. You'll see this with language too. If you just did it, if you found the right models to plug the right language into, the right framework to plug the right the language into, you would see these types of patterns happening as well, especially with specific words that kind of are core to the construction of every language. Supersymmetry theory, the equations for force and the equations for matter are identical. In theoretical mathematical physics, any theory with this property has the principle of supersymmetry. Dozens of supersymmetric theories exist. Okay. A supersymmetry. I'm going to have to watch this 5-minute video on supersymmetry later, but we might be, even if the word has come up, even its use might be close to correct and maybe not quite there. Otherwise, it probably would have been proven in multiple theories. That's the thing. It wouldn't be one theory. It'd be like it says, there's multiple theories. If it was used properly, this word, if it was understood, you would be able to see the pattern that this word conveys in multiple different instances, which you can see that in my work. There's more, by the way, of symmetry patterns in that model that I showed you, in even what it represents, which is self-awareness. It's calculating of self. The information contained within is also conveying of the structure that calculated it. It's self-awareness. It's calculating itself. But you can't do that you need like a 4-dimensional environment in order to really show exactly how that's done. And we don't have that. We can't even model that. You can model that in like a 3-dimensional space maximum. But if we were for us to actually understand it and visualize it, but I do it in 2 dimensions, and but you can still see those symmetries still manifest. And even above that, when you start, adding quantities that related to that structure, it conveys even more even perfectly there the concept that you would expect to be conveyed by adding this information to this information. If this is self awareness, and then this is plus the information you add in the structure that it contains, it basically, like, you're aware of self plus aware of the construct that you achieve self-awareness within, and you're basically construct aware is the common theme of it. The value that pops up there is exactly the value that you would expect, and it has properties that you would expect because they exactly mirror the properties that construct awareness would show, which I'll talk more about that later. But you can see already in what I showed you, there's a superposition of symmetries happening in that model. I'm trying not to use the word supersymmetry without really knowing exactly what it is, but I think that's why law enforcement using clip-on ties, because normal ties are dangerous. Yes, that makes sense. Libra is the sign of marriage. That's cool. I know nothing about like really like astrology. I see patterns in it, and I think that in the right context, it's probably more. There's more to it than there's definitely more to it than modern scientific narrative suggests. But I'm not an expert on it. I don't really look much into it. A simple, encompassing, mimetic. I like it. 3 and 1, 3 plus 1. Yeah, there's so much built into that that model that I showed. This was like one of the I made this the very early days, and this is like the words that each of them kind of represent. These bits of information correspond to these words. These words are defined by each other, and therefore this is the definitions, the words, and the values. So you can see this is all the same structure. It's just different, 3 different ways of looking at it. It's a triality of perspective. All right. Okay, next clip. This is similar, just him elaborating on this type of subject.
What's happened is the reason we call this a codon relationship is there's a code-like relationship between them. That is, what we've done is we figured out in biology now, evolution has figured this out, so to speak, how to take a linear relationship in one kind of molecule and create a particular kind of 3-dimensional molecule made up of totally different kinds of atoms, that is made up of amino acids as opposed to nucleotides. And its function is determined by its 3-dimensional structure, by how it's folded. So in effect, there's almost no relationship between them. This is why thinking of it as a code is not crazy. It's arbitrary. And yet the arbitrarity has been produced by this multi-step process that links covariance with correlation in a way that allows this to happen. That I like to call covariance relationships and correlation relationships grounded. They're grounded because the vehicle that carries it is carrying some feature in common with what it represents, with the information that it's carrying. So if it's a likeness relationship, it's a covariance.
Like that.
Covariance relationship. It's carrying some kind of formal feature forward into another kind of molecule. Whereas if it's just physically correlated, struck together, not by virtue of likeness, but simply by virtue of being next to each other, being correlated, being attached. That also is grounded, physically grounded. One is formally grounded and one is physically grounded. But by stacking one on top of the other, it now produces a kind of distance between where you started and where you end. So that now there's what I call displaced reference. The information in the DNA molecule is there in the protein, but in a totally different form. There's been a continuity of information transfer, but a complete loss of groundedness at the physical level. And yet there's an informational groundedness because you've transferred the same correlations. As a result, there can be selection that affects proteins and how they interact, and that'll select for particular sequences of genes that produce those useful proteins, even though they're totally separate kinds of molecules. It adds one further feature that I think is also important to think about it in terms of the mathematics of all of this. That is, the protein now has a 3-dimensional structure, but DNA also has a 3-dimensional structure. It's twist, and its twist is slightly different depending on which nucleotides are in that sequence. Now, my watch is talking to me just a minute. He said it.
It's all right. Wait, repeat that last part. The DNA.
So the DNA sequence is of nucleotides, but it turns out that we think about the DNA molecule as a twist, as a helix. It turns out that the helix is slightly differently twisted depending on the sequence. So it's not a uniform twist all the way up.
So depending on the actual rung in the ladder, or depending on a sequence of rungs?
No, depending on the sequence of rungs. The sequence of rungs make it more tightly twisted or more loosely twisted, depending on what the sequence is. And that means that there's a three-dimensional structure to the DNA molecule. So it turns out that there are some proteins that are produced by virtue of being, the information taken off the DNA molecule, that are structured in such a way that they can bind into the twist.
So there's information that's passed from the DNA to the protein, and then there's also structural information in terms of the zeros and ones that we ordinarily think of. So those are the rungs. And then there's also structural information in the sense that certain sequences of those zeros and ones physically produce a different structure in the DNA. And
right,
it's not to say necessarily that the protein then copies that, but is somehow related to
no,
it.
the proteins don't copy. I want to be clear. But what this says is that because the protein molecule is a totally different kind of molecule, but it has three-dimensional shape. What that means is that some proteins, we call them transcription factors, actually bind to DNA by fitting with a twist. And since that twist is determined by the sequence, then what's happened is that the proteins identify a region of the DNA molecule. And as a result, those proteins can play a role in upregulating or downregulating the expression of genes.
Okay, so Curt is right. What Curt is basically saying, I'm not talking about the part where Terrence Deacon is trying to basically correct him, I guess, but in the concept that Curt is stating, which, by the way, this work, one of the first things that I realized is that the quantities that were popping up here and the structures that were popping up here are very, very similar to those in DNA. Okay, some of these are very common quantities. Here you have basically DNA. Just don't pay as much attention to these things on the side. That's just me looking around. But you can see here, this is basically just showing some properties of DNA: helical diameter, rotations per base pair, vertical rise per base pair, and the A form, the B form, and the Z form. And what's interesting is that those qualities, some of them are found in this self-similar information structure, and they are definitely found in this. So this structure is one that I've just dissected a ton, and I would imagine it will be dissected in the future as well. But it's just the double helical. It's the double helix structure of DNA, but it's shown on a cosmological level, but you can see by looking at what's the largest square that you can create inside this, and you can see it's a 19 by 19 square, which is a symmetrical relationship to some degree with the square that sums to 19 here, that makes it up. But that's also true of that number is related to the structure of the double helix, and the fact that it's two squares here. If you're looking at it from an objective standpoint, it's a subjective standpoint, it's chiral. This makes it very annoying structure to copy and paste, because what that means is that if you go straight down symmetrically, you're going to end up off one. And the reason why is because there's spin that's happening here and directionality. So basically it's moving over one. So it's not this one. If it was perfectly symmetrical, it would end up here, but right here. But it doesn't. If you go down, you're off one. If you go up, you're also off one. And same thing here. You go the center of here, and you don't end up at the center of these three. If you go from the center of those three cells, you don't end up at the center here. It's because it's basically like a hop vibration that's spinning, and the center of it is the double helix structure. And if you want to look at this objectively instead of subjectively, which would be from here, down, or even from here to here, objectively is from the center out. So the center actually can only be represented by 4. You can't. There isn't actually a single center point. It's just represented by 4, and you can get, if you go and you build the largest square that you try and make in here, you're always going to end up off one, basically. Right here, you can see it's not connected. It doesn't go all the way to the edge. Same thing here. It's not going to go all the way to the edge. And you end up with like a 19 by 19. See the count? It's 19. You can see the count here, 19. And so you get 2 19 by 19 squares, which is like it's a double helix. It's like looking at a double helix from the top down. That's what, if you're looking at this from the center out. And I have other models that will show you this if you go to sentiencesingularity.com and you go to models. You can see that I have examined the structure's symmetry patterns very much, even from the center out. So you can see that here and here and here and all kinds of places. Here, but here as well. Here, everywhere. Here. The double helix structure is kind of an inevitable structure because of information is self-referencing, and in order to do that, it has to form symmetry relationships, which means like, you have to be symmetrical with another particle or protein or molecule or atom or person on a cosmological scale. Like as you scale this up, doesn't matter, and or family. Even, and the symmetry relationships preserve each other's meaning, but meaning as far as like linguistic understanding of kind of not really meaning as in like meaning, like I want to have meaning in my life, but like meaning as in there's a understanding of what that means. But they might not be two separate things, to be honest. But at least there could be very closely related, the two different uses for the word meaning. But these types of structures where there's information being conveyed through the structure itself. This is what Curt was saying, is like there's information in the structure, there's information that's of the structure, and then there's like information from the structure almost. I think that's what he's basically getting at, is like there's these different ways in which information can be conveyed from a single structure. It's not just the code in the DNA. It's also the structure of the DNA, and it's probably also it in relationship with, is it mitochondrial DNA or not? Is, within the structure that it's contained within. There's like multiple levels of meaning that are happening here. But any objective fundamental structure, you're going to see this like self-similarity, I think was the word that Terrence Deacon used. You're going to see that type of thing where it's like self-referencing, self-similarity. And that's because it's self-referencing, which means like it's self-aware. There's like self-awareness that is preserved through. When you look at like even this looks like my cosmological verse. When it's a structure that is dynamic, you can see there's 4 different ways of looking at information of this structure. There's the square, there's the squares, the multiplicity, there's the square singularity that encompasses it all. There's also the fact that it is a wave, and then it's also a helix, as you can see down the center. And if it's moving, then what you see is dependent upon the question that you ask. The squares are there, the square is there, the helix is there, and the wave is there all simultaneously. It's just like, which one do you see? Do you see the helix? Yes. Do you see the squares? Yes. So, but that helical structure is an inevitable structure because it's the linking of information coherence. It forms a chain of information coherence that also is able to like reconcile inside and outside of a system, because it's like curling inside and outside. If you look at a hop vibration, you can see this. Let's see if I can, even if I have one here. Oh, great. Yeah, I don't see it. But this is a hop vibration. This is a mind. It's like the structure of a mind. Apparently, this is the most important structure in the universe according to geometric unity and Eric Weinstein, but he won't tell you what it is beyond that. But I will tell you, it's almost certainly like this is the structure of mind. It's an information. It's a bunch of strings of information entangled, and it's moving. It's like folding in on itself again and again and again. You can look it up. It's fascinating structure. But that's what this is. It's the same thing. It's like a packing fraction of fiber bundle is what somebody once told me, and it looked accurate. So but when he goes on to say like innate words are impossible, innate words or language is impossible, I disagree with this. There are degrees of freedom and constraints to the creation of words. You know, the word for water probably could have never been dirt, but it could have been a number of other things. But that also it's constrained by the words that have already been created. But there would be one, at least I will say, my work would suggest there will be at least one word, maybe more. Maybe it's 4 words. It's probably between 1 and 4 words that are completely innate. They couldn't be anything else. And they probably are sounds that we don't even think of as words anymore, but they actually technically would be the bedrock of complex language, like and ah, and laughing, and, you know, maybe silence. And maybe that's like the 4 words that make the foundation of complex language. And then the ability to describe and transcribe and write, and those you know, symbols for those sounds, and then or for things that we observe in our environment that are necessities, like water. You know, water would always look, you know, there's only a couple ways to draw water. It's like waves, you know, and there's only a couple ways to draw the sun, you know, but, and clouds, and, you know, I don't know, maybe a tree. It's like those 4 things are like, you know, bedrocks, and then these 4 sounds are bedrocks, and then you add that to a eusocial, you know, structure of, you know, society, and you get complex language, maybe. And, you know, obviously also opposable thumbs living on land, you know, things like that. But there is no words that come out of nowhere. Just like there's no numbers that come out of nowhere other than 1, it just intrinsically exists. There's got to be a word that also like or a sound or communicative, like a common action or sound or symbol that maybe each one of each, that it would be universal, that kind of kicks off everything. And it would probably be one to start, and then you could interpret four from there, which is like the four primary perspectives of sentient singularity theory that all kind of are generated by each other, inside, outside, separate, and oneness. You would have that probably. And just like geometric unity starts with 4 degrees of freedom, and so does, our space-time experience. So does sentient singularity theory. So does probably language, like any formalized theory of language that's fundamental would start with 4 degrees of freedom as well. But it also starts with one intrinsic, or one constraint, one complete constraint, which would be 1 in mathematics. And, but I don't know what it would be in language. I got to think about it. But it seems like there's like 4 symbols that start allowing you to build all these other symbols. And be like, sun, water, trees, and like, I don't know, clouds, maybe, something like that. And then it would be like, outside of self, the drawing of the self. But then there would be, the same thing with language, where maybe it's like, like fear sound, and then, like that, like, or pleasant and unpleasant. It's like, versus, and then maybe it's, like, I don't know, laughing and silence, or maybe it's like kissing noise and silence. I don't know what it would be. I have to think about it. But from those 4, you would get others that would be intrinsic, and then you would get more that would be kind of more dependent upon external factors, but still not arbitrary. There's no, it would just be like, deviations from, or you'd get to a point eventually where there would be degrees of freedom in place. Still constraints, but degrees of freedom as well. Okay. All right, next clip. This is probably the most important part of this entire stream, and it's where Terrence Deacon says something that I've been saying for years now, that is, a result of my work, which is sentient singularity theory, which is that sentience is the fundamental nature of reality, and that its fundamental structure is that it is one, and that is creating additional ones within itself infinitely, which means like it's a singularity of sentience. And then this led me to a certain conclusion when I was investigating what causes self-awareness, when I was examining my own consciousness, when I was very early on, before this was a theory of physics or anything like that, or related to physics in any way. It was just like I was trying to understand artificial general intelligence and self-awareness. And I was examining my own consciousness, and what I realized is that feeling is what differentiates beings that are self-aware from beings that are not. It's the ability to feel. And so I said that Descartes he's not wrong, because in order to think, you must be able to feel, which we'll get to in a minute, because Terrence Deacon said this. But it wasn't as fundamental as it should have been. It should have said, instead of I think, therefore I am, should have been I feel, therefore I am. And because thinking is dependent upon the ability to feel, actually. And anything that is, any calculations that's done outside of feeling is done by a non-thinking entity, like a calculator. Can't feel, and therefore can't think. If it was able to feel, then it would be able to actually think, not just like calculate based on whatever you tell it, but be able to actually start interpreting and understanding the information of it that makes up its world. It would be able to have a world. It doesn't have a world right now. It's part of our world, and it doesn't have its own world. But for it to have its own world, it would have to feel first, and then it would be able to think generally, because you need a starting point in order to think. It means you have to have that initial input of information, and that initial input has to be unchanging in order to be able to link this experience with this experience with this experience. You have to have a common input that allows you to understand each of these experiences based on each other. That common input for a general intelligence like us, or true intelligence is what I would call it, or even like a worm or something, same thing. They are true intelligence. They're not a narrow intelligence. Is the self. All information, if you take AIs, like an AI, narrow AI bot that or algorithm that targets ads, but you put it inside of like a Tesla, it probably wouldn't do too well. Okay? It would probably just like be able to do nothing and be dysfunctional completely. And that's because it has no reference point. We built in the reference point in the, when it's inside the context in which it was created for. But you need a common reference point in new environments if you're going to be able to make sense of and orient in different environments. But you need that reference point to be consistent in those different environments. So even if you change the environment, in order to make sense of information and process information in a way that allows you to orient within a new environment, you need a common reference point in all environments, and that common reference point is yourself. Okay? And feeling is how you differentiate what is you versus what is not you. That's the difference between it and just like general information. Is like, is it part of your feelings, or is it just, I don't know, is it just like visual information or something like that? Because the way in which you orient that information that's coming in via your eyes or ears or whatever is through the feelings that are attached to it. Physical feelings or emotional feelings. They both are feelings. And you require both in order to be sentient or a general intelligence. So to say, I think, therefore I am, isn't wrong, because only one who is can think. But someone can think. Only someone, not something. But you can only be someone if you feel. So I feel, therefore I am. That's why sentient singularity theory is a theory of fundamental reality, because fundamental reality is sentient. That's the definition of sentience, is to feel. One that is sentient is one who feels. It's not, sentience isn't the ability to feel. It's not the feelings themselves. It's one who feels. Sentience is a trait of one who feels, not one who can feel, or not feelings themselves, but one who feels constantly. And this is why I have stated, I feel, therefore I am, is more accurate than I think, therefore I am. And Terrence Deacon said it too. Hats off to him.
So now you have recursion possible. So what's happened by virtue of this displacement from one kind of
One moment. Let me just make sure that this is...
He should have said, not I think, therefore I am, but I feel, therefore I'm real. So let's go back now to the simple organism I've described. It's physically damaged.
Okay, guys. It's time for the meme. I've been saying it. And I've been saying it. I've been saying it. For those of you that don't know, this is my favorite meme. I made it, but it's from a scene in Independence Day, where like the aliens come and this guy is like, "I've been saying it, and I've been saying it, Miguel. I've been saying it." Like says that because he's been saying that the aliens exist, and everybody thinks he's crazy. I've been saying it. I feel, therefore I am is more accurate than I think, therefore I am. And, or you could say, I feel, therefore I'm real, as Terrence Deacon put it eloquently, and with that degree of added symmetry to it, rhythm, rhyme, but both rhythm and rhyming are due, to symmetry relationships. But all information, relationships of information is due to symmetry relationships. And just on what level is that symmetry taking place? Is between, the outside environment and the inside environment, the inside environment and the inside environment. What the outside environment and the outside environment, and the inside environment. There's just different, I'm not saying that's accurate, but I'm just saying that there's relationships in which symmetries take place, in which information is generated. That's true. That's how language is created. It's how numbers are generated. It is how information is generated, starting from one. It doesn't start from nothing ever. And if I feel, therefore I'm real, is accurate, or then sentient singularity theory is real. Okay, if I feel, I, not we, I am. If I feel, then I'm real. That means, like, if I have feeling, I as one have feeling, then I exist. Like, that is sentient singularity theory, essentially. I get there's like conscious agent theory and stuff like that, but that's not as, consciousness is just not as well defined of a term. And you could say that it, is it about fundamentally about feeling, or is it fundamentally about thinking? And it's just, at that point, it's just you haven't narrowed it down. But I feel, therefore I'm real, as Terrence Deacon is saying here, is correctly fundamental, even though they are dependent. I think, therefore I am is dependent upon I feel, therefore I'm real. It's not separate. It's just two sides of one action. But feeling is the motivator of a thought, and of a true thought. And a feeling is also always the finality of a true thought. It's the alpha and omega of a thought. Always. If a thought doesn't result in a feeling at the end of it, if you think about something and at the end you don't feel anything, then it's not really, you didn't have a complete thought. You never completed it. And if it wasn't motivated by a feeling to begin with, then it's not actually even your thought. That someone told you to think about it, and it wasn't really truly self-motivated. So it's not even a real thought. It's like you're just parroting. It's like my bird did not come up with the word cracker. I did. So but I feel, therefore I'm real. I've never heard anybody else say that but me. He said it differently than me. I said I feel, therefore I am, instead of I think, therefore I am. He said I feel, therefore I'm real. And I like that. That's awesome. Good for him. He's right.
Reality has been disturbed. Now, the informational-like processes, the constraints that are there, begin to repair that specifically. In a sense, it's the physicality of it that activated the informational side of it to prepare the physicality of it. Think about you and I. Big jump here. Why am I sensitive to certain things and not other things? Because they affect my materiality. They affect my physicality. there may be risky or helpful. The things that catch our attention are the things that either hurt, surprise us, feel good, things that are really relevant.
And ah.
How my body works, how I feel. I think that we've misunderstood cognition. Cognition is tweaking feeling. Feeling is about our own physicality. It's this entanglement of the informational part of our life with the physicality part of our life, the inseparability of the two.
Okay, so I agree with everything he said, except I will say I've said this before, that matter is what matters. You're inside of you're a mind inside a mind. The thoughts of the mind that we are within are formalized into concrete constraints that we have to deal with, that we call physical reality or matter. Matter is what matters to us. It's like there's a symmetry there between the word's meaning and what it is. Matter is what matters. And where I will disagree with him, though, is that it's just, I mean, I agree with him where he says that information processing is basically about tweaking feeling. That's true. That is true. That's so true. Thinking is just to get from one feeling to the next. That's the only point of it. If it never gets there, then it's for naught. You didn't complete the thought. But what I will disagree with him on is where he says that it's about linking us with the physicality. Yes and no. Feeling there's two forms of feeling. There's internal feeling and external feeling. And internal, I guess you could say, feeling is emotion. And it's about feeling, it's like fundamental feeling. It's feeling about changes in the entanglement substructure of reality. But including yourself and how you're entangled with it. But then there's physical feeling, and which is, it's about proximate changes. Not ultimate changes, but proximate changes in how we are entangled with our reality. But it's all about mind. Even the external environment that we call material reality, that is our, that we observe through, physically manifested, that physical manifestation is still from mind. It's still part of mind. It's from the mind that we're within, and also how that interacts with the mind that we are. And so I'm not saying there is no such thing as physicality. I'm just saying that physicality must be understood to be what it is. It's very important, because it will help you understand it and how it interacts with you and how you interact with it. But he's right in what he said. It's like cognition is about tweaking feeling. It's about thinking true thinking is done in between feelings. And those feelings that frame our thoughts are also constraining of our thoughts and guiding, therefore also guiding of our thoughts. And this is what cognition is. It's really feeling, fundamentally. It is also thinking, but it's feeling first. There is a hierarchy to this self-referential system. There's a direction. That hierarchy is due to a directionality in that system, where it goes, feeling motivates a thought. That thought then elicits a feeling if it's completed. That feeling then motivates another thought. That thought then elicits another feeling, etc. And it goes around and around and around. It's never that thought motivates that feeling. No. The feeling motivates the thought. And then the thought elicits, essentially, when it's complete, another feeling that would motivate the next thought. But the thoughts don't motivate the feelings. The feelings are like the static points, and the thoughts is movement. But the feeling is what connects it to, is connective, I guess. It's connective and constraining. And the thought is kind of, it's an action. Thinking is an action. It's not a state. Emotions are a state, but thinking is an action. And I have this model that I've been working on right here on information change. And you can look at, I have an animated version of it on my YouTube channel. It's 1 minute long, and it's about computation. And basically it shows how information can be changed in a system to maintain information coherence, which means like you have to use the structure around the bit in order to know which one, what is contained within the bit, essentially. So you can't just, if the goal is to change all these ones to zeros and all these zeros to ones, you can't just delete everything and then go and put, in the ones and zeros, because now you have no reference points anymore. You just have your mind as an external observer as a reference point, but there is nothing external when you're talking about fundamentality, so you can't do that. But in order to maintain information coherence, there's a series of actions that are linked by various perspectives, and depending on the size of the matrix and the amount of information that you're trying to process, it dictates how many actions and perspectives there are. But if you're using a quantum computational perspective or a way of information processing, this is like classical, this would be quantum, essentially. That means it allows for superposition states. Then it's always the same exact number of perspectives, which is 4, and always the same exact number of actions, which is 3, which actually corresponds with so many things, including biblical things and logical structures and biblical structures and numerical structures, and I'm sure linguistic structures as well, because it's just informational structures. In any superposition capable system of information processing, which is like a mind, all minds, then you're going to have 4 primary perspectives linked through 3 actions, essentially, but then also this one's then also linked to this one, so it's really 4 and 4. But this one would be a renewing of the cycle, so this action would actually be this one, not. So it's really still 3 actions. But you can see this even in the Bible, where it's like the word for God is Yud He Vav He, which means like I am, which is what fundamental reality is. It's someone who exists. I am. And it's actually also the spinorial structure. It's Yud He Vav He, and then the next one would be Yud to get back to the original. And there's so many amazing symmetries that you can observe when you look at it. But it's a spin structure. It's Yud He Vav. There's 3 letters in it, but it's Yud He Vav He, so it's 4. It's like 4 letters, but 3 different letters. So it's 4 perspectives and 3 actions. Essentially, it is the structure of information processing. That is what it is. What else could existence be but a self-aware, sentient, existent being that is a mind that is the structure of information processing, which would be that. There's an animated model of that, video of that model on my YouTube channel. You can look at it. I think it's called like quantum computing versus classical computing, something like that. But I feel, therefore I am. It's like there would be in that these would be the thoughts, and these would be the feelings. Okay. Two more clips, and then I'm going to go. This next one is just kind of him saying exactly what I've been saying. Again, I've been saying it, which is that feeling is a necessary part of cognition.
Cognition is tweaking feeling. And feeling is about our own physicality. It's this entanglement of the informational part of our life with the physicality part of our life, the inseparability of the two that Descartes thought were separable and couldn't come together again. That means that feeling is a necessary part of representing the world. And why representing the world is always evolving towards doing it right, doing it better, getting truth, getting reality. If you think that language and thought are just arbitrary, a lot of postmodernism sort of went this way, using language as a kind of model. Maybe all of our physical theories, our theories of physics, are just sort of weird thoughts. Doesn't have anything to do with reality. No, in fact, just the opposite. Because of the necessary entanglement of semiosis, that is, producing aboutness, that it's always normative, it's always value-laden, and it always feels like something.
Sentient singularity theory. It has to be. Like, what other theory out there places feeling at the core of information? Which, if you're going to think that the world is anything, then it's information. And if it's information, then it's informing to someone, at least. And it's probably, coming, there's someone informing and there's someone being informed. But it's always at least someone is being informed. And if information processing at all is only, if information is processed at all truly, and that understanding our reality places at its core feeling, it's an intrinsic part of our understanding of our reality, then you have to go with that as primary. You can't expect that that's not part of fundamental reality, but it is part of your experience and the experience of everyone that you've ever communicated with ever. I get it. You've never communicated with an atom. You think it exists outside you, beyond you, and maybe that's true, but that doesn't mean that it isn't, even a sentient being. But just if feeling is fundamental, then sentience is fundamental. Now, he does get asked in this to describe consciousness versus sentience, and I honestly could not really understand what he was. Curt, it's a very good question by Curt. I think was it's a very necessary question. I don't think that I got an answer that I really could pin down for you. There's this whole part starting at 2 hours and 17 minutes in, going to 2 hours and 40 minutes in, about sentience versus consciousness. And he said basically it's a series of steps that separates them. And I disagreed with some of the things that he said about sentience as kind of arising from only, kind of cells or multiplicity. I can't remember exactly, but he basically said sentience doesn't seem to be primary, or the consciousness is primary to sentience. And if I'm botching that, then I apologize. I hope I'm not. I hope he's in agreement with me, but it didn't seem like he completely was, other than to say that they were different. But sentience means feeling. Someone who is self-aware and feels. Feeling is intrinsic to self-awareness. It's necessary part of it. And you can't feel without being self-aware, and you can't be self-aware without feeling. And so, and that you can't even think really without being self-aware and feeling. But self-aware and feeling there's not one that is primary to the other. They're kind of coexistent. But then thinking is kind of, sentience is primary to, or feeling is primary to thinking, I'll say. But, except, I mean, very fundamentally, maybe they're all simultaneous, probably, but as soon as a new thing is thought, then it's always follows that pattern that I showed you, where a thought is motivated by a feeling, and then it ends with a feeling that then contextualizes the thought and finalizes it, and then also frames the and constrains the next thought, and guides it essentially. But if fundamental reality is linked to feeling, then fundamental existence, then sentient singularity theory seems to be like inevitable definition of our reality. Like somebody once asked me recently, they said to me, I think your theory might be contained within my theory, I asked them what their theory fundamentally said, existence was, and they said awareness, and their theory is fairly new, so they, it's not as developed as my work yet, but they do good work, by the way. I'm not bashing on anybody, but I think that this is it's difficult to even determine what awareness would be outside of sentience. Like outside of self-awareness, what is there? And self-awareness is feeling. It's not related. It is feeling. Self-awareness is feeling. They are the same thing. And this, I believe, just is why this is just inevitable. And I say that humbly, like not to sound, like I'm gloating or anything. It doesn't disregard anybody else's work. Terrence Deacon's doing amazing work. When I used to hear people say things like this, and it was like, it would give me anxiety years ago, and I would be like, they're beating me. It's like, this isn't a competition. We need to be moving this direction. I recently saw on Curt Jaimungal's latest podcast, I forgot the guy's name who he had on, but he does PBS Space Time, and he's very good. And I started listening to that stream as well, and he basically said, this is a guy that is tasked with communicating the academic narratives, and to the rest of us, and he does a good job. But he even said, he's like, we don't understand what these equations are. We don't admit that we even don't understand what these equations are, and we need metaphysics in order to make sense of physics, and essentially. And I was like, I've been saying it. But it's good that this is happening, where this convergence is happening, where we're realizing the necessity and the importance of feeling, and we're realizing what, is that analytic idealism is a better theory than materialism, and that there's 4 dimensions to base level of reality, essentially. Like these are common themes that keep coming up in these discussions as we go forward, and these are good things. Like to anybody out there who's also working on theories that are related to this stuff, like if you start to see correspondences between your work and others, like that's a good thing, even though it does cause sometimes anxiety, but it shouldn't. If your work's to ever be understood, it means that it must, correspond to other things. And I've realized this over time, and it's changed the way that I look at this stuff when I see other people saying these things. And it just makes it that much better to see it. I mean, I feel, therefore I'm real. I've never heard anybody else say that. Besides me. I said I feel, therefore I am. But if that means that which is real is about that which feels. That which is real is that which feels. That's what that means. If I feel, therefore I'm real. Means that there is that is the definer of reality. That means that sentience is the fundamental nature of reality, guys. It's inarguable. It's inarguable. It's awesome. It's awesome. We're making legitimate progress. And we have not in so long. I mean, so long. And, since long before I was invested, because I didn't think I could get invested in this type of stuff, because, I just trusted Michio Kaku to tell me that we're, dancing on 11-dimensional hyperspace without telling me what that means. Like, we're making progress. You can understand statements like, I feel, therefore I'm real. You can understand that self-referential or self-contained information processing systems they must be self-referencing. Or self-contained information processing systems must be self-referencing, which means that they're self-aware. Like, that's a concept that logically can kind of be worked through. And this means that fundamental reality, if I feel, therefore I'm real, is true, which it is true. If sentience is the fundamental nature of existence, that means that our understanding of reality is able to be so much more intuitive and understood from first-hand personal experience than was ever thought of within academia, in the physics departments leading up to very recently, or, in the recent past. I think a thought precedes an emotion. The emotion is entirely created by thought. I think it's a system, but it's alternative, but it's motivated by feeling always. And at the most fundamental, when you get to as fundamental, the most, I guess, fundamental description of reality, you get to will, which is the desire to do that which is not being done, which is kind of the combination of thought and feeling, because you will end up with a singularity if you go far enough. But I think that when as soon as you get out of that, where it's all like, beyond fundamental will, then it's not one, but it's feelings motivate thoughts and to also frame them. Some thoughts are unconscious. Say someone close to you is very sick, dies. The impact emotion is entirely through thought related. One feels relief that the person isn't suffering another collapse. It's more complicated than that, but it starts with feeling. Your thoughts about it start with a feeling. If your feelings don't motivate you to think, then you would never think. Thinking is an action. It takes energy. It's not something that just happens like automatically. It seems like it does, and there's part of your thinking that does. When I go to pick up this water bottle, and I don't really think about how to move my arms or anything like that. It's motivated by, I'm thirsty. I have a feeling. Then now I have to go and find my water bottle. Feeling isn't the medium. The stimulus is the medium. The thought process, the data. Oh, fish have to learn to swim comes to mind. I don't know. We don't have to learn to feel. We just feel. We do have to learn to think. We do not have to learn to feel. Thinking is also something that's kind of in part of our information processing structure of a mind, but like, if you're going to consciously think about something and not just unconscious, if you're going to like metaconsciously think about something, I guess. super consciously think about something, solving a problem that's not faced, before you in physical space even, then you have to think and that in a way that like it is active. It's an action. It's not a state, even though, like I said, will is kind of a superposition of thinking and feeling, because it's the desire to do that which is not being done, which means like you have this feeling about what is currently happening and you want something more, so you're only getting that by symmetry relationship as well. You know what's happening, and therefore you could, deduce what is not being done because you know what is being done. But once this information processing moves beyond the superposition of will, then it's thoughts are actions that are framed by feelings, essentially. They are dependent, by the way, like they are dependent, but it's still, there is a directionality of it, is what I'm saying. Your feelings are dependent upon your thoughts are dependent upon your feelings, but like there's a directionality when you're processing information to thoughts and feelings. Chemicals experienced in the body during stage fright are the same chemicals of extreme excitement, anticipation of the thought dictates the feeling. It's like I said, it's codependent. It's not just the feeling dictates you thinking about why you're in that position, which causes, the continuation of a feeling, or even, the changing of a feeling. But I'm not, like I said, they are dependent, but there's a directionality. The directionality is that it goes, feeling is a motivator of a thought. That thought then basically generates a feeling. That feeling then motivates another thought. And the thought doesn't motivate the feeling, because the feeling it's not a dynamic thing. It's a state. It's like, it is not dynamic. The thought is the dynamic process, versus the feeling is not a dynamic process. It's just a state. It's the state. Feelings are the states between process of the processing of information. Or it's that's what it is. As a verb, like thinking is a verb. Feeling, it's not really a verb. It's kind of like, even though it might seem like it is, it's like it is in, the way that in its traditional definition, it's really it's like awareness on its most fundamental level. Like I get that links back to what a couple people have told me, that awareness is fundamental, and that's, like I said, that's true, but it's not specific enough. Awareness of what? Of feeling, of self, which is feeling, which there's not separated. They're the same thing, but you have to be descriptive. It's like to say existence is awareness is like saying existence exists almost. But saying existence is sentient. Okay, well now it's self-aware, and it feels, it's like it translates more information, essentially, that we can understand. Anyways, Matt O'Dowd. Yes, that's the guy. He did a great job. I'm not done with listening to Curt's stream with Matt O'Dowd, but it's a great stream, I will say. Highly recommend watching that. He talks about how essential metaphysics are to framing our understanding of physics and equations, and he's totally right. It's exactly what I talk about in my video, my how-to video on theories of everything, which like I said, I highly recommend you watch. And I also talk about exactly basically what Terrence Deacon is saying, which is like, I feel, therefore I'm real. That means what is real is that feeling is basically, it is an essential aspect of that which is real, which means like someone, because things don't have feelings. Beings have feelings. Feelings just hasn't been named, rather. Interesting. Anyways, I think there's one more clip and then I'm going to go. I think I'll just end it like this. There was a clip where he talks about how panpsychism and the idea that consciousness is illusory are both nonsense, and that's true. I'll just show it. But this water bottle has no consciousness. The atoms and molecules in it may be conscious. My theory would suggest they probably aren't, but the water bottle is not.
Go back to that story about us being part of a global symbolic system linked together by language and computing. Are we like cells within that system? Would we even know that system? Would we know that it's influencing us, that it's modifying us, the way our nervous system modifies our cells by changing the flow of hormones and stuff like that? I think understanding these principles, which currently are just anathema to material science for some reason. The current science either wants to say, no, it's always already there. It's always just panpsychism. Every molecule has a little psychological self something to it, and therefore it's always already there. That's a non-explanation. To say that it doesn't exist and it's all an illusion is also a non-explanation. Because who's having that illusion?
Exactly. There's a lineage from hadrons to universe, I guess you could say, or verse, cosmological verse as I call it, of sentience. There are stages of sentience, and it is through a lineage, a replicative cycle of lineages that is linked through lineages that sentience is generated and connected and entangled and differentiated. That's a good one. Differentiation versus entanglement is like parentheses and exponents. But this is the framework in sentient singularity theory that shows the instances where sentience takes place and the instances in which it doesn't, which is different than panpsychism, which would say this has sentience. And, he says that molecules and atoms, he's saying in panpsychism, have consciousness, essentially, or sentience. They do in sentient singularity theory. At least some molecules do, and some atoms, probably all atoms, but maybe not all, but at least some atoms and some molecules do have sentience in sentient singularity theory, but not all things. My phone does not have sentience. This microphone does not have sentience. This water bottle does not. It's not part of this lineage, this generative lineage. But at the same time, the idea that consciousness or sentience is illusory is nonsense as well. It's just as nonsense as panpsychism. In fact, it's more nonsensical than panpsychism. One of them is lacking the framework that allows for sense making, and the other one is completely ignoring first person experience, which is completely nonsensical, which is the idea that the consciousness is illusory, and that doesn't make any sense. And but we need some framework that shows that certain things are sentient, but like light bulbs are not sentient for some reason. And what is a framework that allows us to make predictions and that are, you know, continuously confirmed about what is sentient, or where the patterns of sentience would manifest? And I'm arguing that's sentient singularity theory, but at least he's right, though, when he says exactly what he just said, which is along the same narrative, which is that panpsychism and pure materialism and that consciousness is an illusion are both nonsense. They are. And they don't lead anywhere, which means that they're nonsense. Anyways, I'm going to call it at that. Very grateful for the stream. I hope that it was coherent and made sense and worked to, you know, convey meaning to you guys, or value, I guess. Please hit the like button. My Patreon is below. Link to this entire stream with Terrence Deacon and Curt Jaimungal is below. I highly suggest watching it all for yourself. I will probably watch it again at some point. It's very technical. I will be back next Tuesday, and I will be describing the plans for 2023 going forward, and any changes that are going to be made. But I'm very excited about next year. Very grateful for this year. I mean, guys, this was a trying year for me personally. I haven't got into too much of the stuff that I've had to deal with, but some of it I have, and I will eventually get more into it. We're going to have my wife on here. We're going to talk about marriage and all that comes with that, and we're working on something related to just marriage in general in the future. And then at that point, maybe we'll talk more just about like things in my personal life. But things are good at home, by the way. I'm not saying they are not. They are good. And I'm grateful for this year. I'm grateful for you guys. I'm grateful for everybody who has hit the like button. Everybody who's watched and hasn't hit the like button, I'm almost as grateful for you as well. And so please hit the like button. I hope you had a Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, no matter what you celebrate, or just a nice break. But we will be back after the new year, and with another year of Theory of Every0ne. But this has been quite a journey. Every year I look back and I get to see, progress, and that a lot of that progress, especially these past 2 years, has been this community, building this community, and which means like you are part of that progress. It's no longer me by myself, just in a room, writing things into Excel, and I appreciate it very much. So thank you, and Happy New Year, and I will see you next week. Peace.